Good morning and a hearty welcome on today's virtual meeting that has been organized by Katiba Institute and Kituo cha Katiba. By way of introduction, my name is Dibala Ainer and I'll be your facilitator in today's virtual workshop, which we are training our focus on presidential term limits and consolidation of democracy. This is a series of virtual workshops that will be running in 4 parts, beginning today, where we'll be training our focus on experiences from Kenya and Uganda on the importance of presidential term limits in consolidating democracy and lessons to learn from each other on how to either organize and agitate for the institution of presidential term limits or to stop their removal. And of course, this is not a new phenomenon. Term limits by no means it's not a new phenomenon, as I've mentioned, having both been debated and implemented as far back as ancient Greece. Athenian democracy embraced the use of term limits for certain offices, as did the Roman Republic. Both of these foundational civilizations recognized the inherent danger to democracy of a ruler or certain officials consolidating power and remaining in office indefinitely. Aristotle once weighed in on the subject, asserting that a man should not hold the same office twice, and that the tenure of all offices should be brief. Now, there is a mounting concern in Africa about a lack of leadership, as well as an increasing trend of hard-won democratic rights being reversed. One way this is being done is through presidential term limits being abandoned or extended. This in turn is leading to a reemergence of authoritarian politics and political violence. That's why today we're endeavoring to discuss this matter using 4 subjects, as I've mentioned before: presidential term limits and consolidation of democracy. But before we drill deeper, of course, I want to introduce our panelists and also welcome you, our participants as well. Just know at the tail end of this, we shall be having an opportunity for you also to fire your questions. So you should be following doggedly this particular workshop from now until the end, and then we'll give you that handy opportunity to ask questions as well. But I want to introduce our panelists who will take us through this particular session this morning. I will begin with Bobby Mkangi. Bobby Mkangi is a lawyer based in Nairobi who consults independently both locally and internationally. He was a member of the Committee of Experts for Constitutional Review in Kenya, that is the COE, in 2009 up to 2010, that delivered Kenya's constitution. Also, he has participated and advised in various constitution making and transitional justice processes in Kenya and beyond, including Tanzania, Zimbabwe, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia. Mkangi is also an author, serves in various boards, including the National Democratic Institute, Kenya Board Secretary, and the Kituo cha Katiba as well, and is also a recipient of national and other honors as well. We have also, all the way from Uganda, Honorable Dr. Miria Matembe. Dr. Miria Matembe holds a degree in law from Makerere University, a Master's of Law from Warwick University in the United Kingdom, and an honorary Doctor of Laws from University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Is a lawyer by profession. She's an advocate of women's rights in Uganda for over 2 decades, beginning in 1989. Also, she was a member of Uganda's parliament and worked in the Ugandan government as a minister for ethics and integrity from 1998 to 2003, after which time she became a member of the Pan-African Parliament representing Uganda. Next, we have James Mkubi. James Mkubi is a lawyer by training, a social justice activist, and practices international human rights law. He currently directs programs at Kituo cha Katiba in Uganda. He has previously worked at several other organizations, and he is the current chairperson of the Civil and Political Rights Working Group under the Network for Public Interest Lawyers using public interest litigation in the quest for social justice in Uganda, as well as guest lecturer at Public Interest Law Clinic, all based at the School of Law, Makerere University. And lastly, but not least, we have Professor Jill Cottrell-Guy. She's a professor of law in numerous institutions. She has taught law at universities in Nigeria and UK and Hong Kong for over 40 years, having studied law at the London School of Economics and the Yale Law School. Towards the end of that career, she was particularly involved in teaching economic, social, and cultural rights, and she also had the chance to act as advisor on the constitution-making processes of several countries, including East Timor, Nepal, Maldives, Iraq, and Somalia. Since 2008, she has been involved in educating about and pushing for the implementation of the 2010 Constitution of Kenya. And in 1995, she was a member of the Constitutional Commission that drafted the Uganda Constitution. Also, we shall not, this is actually Dr. Maria, I should say, but that is basically from Professor Jill Cottrell, a guy who also, she's the chairperson of Kituo cha Katiba here in Nairobi. So we want to drill deeper and of course get to hear welcoming remarks from the executive director of Kituo cha Katiba in Kenya, and also Kituo cha Katiba in Uganda, and Katiba Institute here in Kenya. Allow me to welcome Christine Nkonge. Christine, good morning and good to see you. Just give us some welcoming remarks, and then we shall proceed from here.
Thank you, Dibal, and also, my gratitude to the panelists for being able to join us in this first webinar in a series of 4, as we interrogate the issue of oversight of executive power through presidential term limits to promote democracy and constitutionalism. So we are doing this project together with Kituo cha Katiba in Uganda, which is a like-minded organization that has similar goals as Katiba Institute. And together we'll interrogate the issue of, oversight of a use of executive power through presidential term limits in Kenya and Uganda. I think it is a timely discussion, especially in Kenya, where currently there are discussions on whether or not to amend the constitution, and there is going to be a political change in leadership following the next general election. And so those two issues together mean that they have sentiments that have come in that give concern on issues to do with oversight of executive power. So I am very happy and to start this discussion and to engage discourse between all of us. And just to welcome you all for this webinar and in a series of 4. Thank you so much, Dibal.
Thank you, Christine. Let's cross over to Uganda and also get some welcoming remarks as well from Edith Kibalama of Kituo cha Katiba. Edith, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chair. I wish on behalf of Kituo cha Katiba to welcome everybody. And we thank the panelists, Mr. Bobby Mukangi, who also happens to be a board member of Kituo cha Katiba, and Honorable Miriam Matembe, for agreeing to share their experiences and thoughts with us today over this important subject. I just wish to underscore the importance of the theme of today's meeting, especially given the trend, the emerging trend on the continent as a whole, but also in East Africa in particular, regarding the reversal or the lifting of presidential term limits, and what this means for our democracy. I should emphasize as well that Uganda offers a good learning model for the region because of its unique experiences. Namely, the overwhelming need at the time of making our constitution for presidential term limits, especially given our turbulent history, but also the intensity with which the removal was resisted, the removal of the presidential term limits. And I think this resistance, in a sense, still continues up to this day, because currently we even have a private member's bill before Parliament, our Parliament, in which there's an urge to reintroduce presidential term limits. This, of course, is not to downplay the experiences from elsewhere and from Kenya. All these are critical for us in terms of learning. So it is our hope that we can use this platform today to reflect deeper and learn more about this important subject so that we can look forward and improve our democracy in the region. So once again, thank you so much and wish you very good discussions.
Thank you, Edith, all the way from Uganda. Now, we want to drill deeper into our discussion. And of course, we shall begin looking at what has been the current state of play as far as the constitution and presidential term limits is concerned here in the country, harking back to the drafting of the constitution. And this is where I want to rope you in, Bobby Mukangi, just to begin with. Maybe I can get a 1-minute introductory remarks as far as constitution drafting in Kenya on presidential term limits is concerned. Briefly, Bobby, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As the previous speakers have said, Christine and Edith, I take this opportunity to thank Kituo cha Katiba and Katiba Institute for organizing this very timely discussion. They have enumerated the context, the fact that there is a reversal in the democratic gains that Africans and particularly East Africans had achieved through the democratic movement that we saw in the 90s and in the 2000s. But this is being clawed back. And I think this discussion is timely for the entire continent, for East Africa, and for Kenya. And just to mention that dealing with this issue, and here in Kenya also particularly, when we talk about presidential term limits, we must appreciate it in the terms of what it links towards as an instrument of trying to contain this big societal creation called power. And we know power tends towards domination. Power tends towards being monarchical. Democracy is one concept that tries to contain this tendency of power towards tyranny. Term limits have been used, and you have seen, to an advantage in many jurisdictions to add value to the democratic movement that espouses and desires to contain this leviathan, this beast called power. And so in Kenya, with Kenyans clamoring to have presidential term limits, they were and are speaking to the fact that power, as is contained in the Constitution, belongs to the people, the first article. And this power, with all the instruments, with all the concepts that have been thrown at it, human rights, justice, fairness, equality, equitability, and facilities like term limits, are ventures towards ensuring that it is the man, woman, and child who have power. And that is why, since 1992, when presidential term limits were reintroduced in Kenya, the discourse has actually been towards retaining and entrenching presidential term limits. And that is why when we were drafting the Constitution as a committee of experts, and as you said, between 2009 and 2010, the issue of presidential term limits, as was espoused in the previous constitution, or constitution and draft constitution thereof, that no person could hold or could be president for more than 2 terms, and the term for presidency being 5 years. This was born of the struggle and the experiences that Kenyans had since independence, when the independence constitution was emasculated to create life presidency. And this is where you see the clamor and the fight commence, but build impetus institutionally, organizationally, from 1991 onwards. We know that term limits were introduced into our constitution, yes, because of the clamor by Kenyans through representative organizations, but also we must be alive to the fact that it was a bargaining chip for Moi to sustain being in power beyond 1991. So it was what was agreed for, that Moi could continue ruling even with the change of constitution, even with the inclusion of or bringing back multi-party democracy. But Moi could be allowed to continue as long as the 2-term limit facility was included in the changes. And we also we've seen this.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby. I still need to interpose a bit, maybe, and cross over also to Dr. Miria in Uganda. Doctor, you took members of the 10th Parliament to the Constitutional Court, accusing them of unlawfully removing presidential term limits during the constitutional amendments of 2005. And of course, also you've written your book extensively on this as well. You've had experiences that we've had here in Kenya from Bobby, and of course we shall also continue to drill deeper on that with him. Just give us also your experience from Uganda, briefly, Daktari.
I just want to thank you also for organizing this conference, because this topic is very, very crucial for the African people. As a mother in Africa, I have seen it all, I have heard it all, and I'm crying even up to now as to when Africans will really come to themselves, look inside themselves, and ask why we should be like this. Now, as you have heard, I have been in politics since the 1986 when Museveni came to power, but I was already born when Obote came to power. I come from a country, Uganda, which is very unique, because this is a country which we are 2 months to 52 years of independence. We have never experienced or seen a peaceful handover of power from one elected president to another. It is so painful. When one is entering, another is running away. We have not seen the joy of seeing a happy president handing over the leadership of this country to another happy president. So this is experience with which, when I was appointed to be a member of the Uganda Constitutional Commission in 1988, that was facing Uganda. Briefly, when we got independence in 1962, Obote, of course, received power from colonial masters on the basis of a constitution of 1962. This constitution in 1964 was abrogated by Obote when he fought with the Kabaka of Uganda, and after that, he brought in what we call a pigeonhole constitution and started running that until eventually we came to one-party state. And of course, eventually, Amin in 1971 came and overthrew Obote and his constitution, and of course started ruling by decrees down the road. The UN, whatever UNRF came, overthrew. So by the time President Museveni and his Bushmen came to power, there was a big need to really have a new constitution to build Uganda as a country afresh. And so what happened? Museveni's entry saw the coming in of a new constitution, which started by the establishment of the Constitutional Commission in 1988, which constituted 21 members. One of our members, actually, Professor Sempegwa, helped you, the Kenyans, with their constitution. And I personally traversed Kenya during those times, the long period when Kenya was trying to make its constitution. And in fact, my expertise on making the Uganda constitution helped a number of countries like South Africa in terms of women and the constitutional rights. So we started, the commission had 21 members, of whom were 2 women, and I was one of them. We started our work in 1988. You know, we had to first educate our 1889. We first had to educate ourselves as a commission, the members get together, get to know one another, get each other's specialties, and see how we do the work. Because it was really sensitive work. You are saying, who are on commission? You know Africa, tribalism, ethnicism, who is on the constitution? Is it Vanyankore? Is it what? All that. So when we came together, coming from all sorts of views and political dimensions, we had to educate ourselves on our exercise. The law which established us was telling us what we should do. And so after educating ourselves, we decided to draw a program for starting our work. And we started with educating the public on the need for a new constitution. Why a constitution? And what must
Dr. Maria, allow me to just interpose.
Because we had to really get whatever we put in the constitution from the people themselves.
Good. Allow me to just interpose a bit and also call in Mr. Nkubi to tell us more about the Ugandan experience as well. And you've had, yes, how instrumental Dr. Maria has been also in making sure that the petition is steamrolled in the courts. And she has acknowledged also Professor Frederick Zipembwa, who was very instrumental also in the constitutional processes reformation here in the country as well. But from your experience and your learning so far, Mr. Nkubi, do you think President Yoweri Museveni and his national resistance movement have used the power of the presidency, state resources, patronage, and intimidation to ensure a favorable outcome at every electoral turn?
Yeah, thank you. I have, and I take it that you grant me authority to proceed without video. Otherwise, there'll be instability. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my views. And I mean, your question is as blunt as requiring a simple yes and a mute. You know, because this has been the experience. When you look at the context of our country, you must appreciate, and probably what you've hinged on, the importance of a 3-peer approach when it comes to consolidation of power. Yes. The 3-peer approach here I'm talking about is the use of money, which some people have Christianized commercialization of politics or elections.
Yes.
But also the use of coercive force, which is incarnate in the military here. And of course, unlike you in Kenya, our military here or our defense forces are actually, and they just metamorphosed to Uganda People's Defense Forces, but initially they were a guerrilla force begun by someone, which means that when you talk of a guerrilla force, you're talking about loyalty and allegiance to the founder. And the need for that transition to happen from a guerrilla force to a purely national state institution that is representative of people's aspirations and ideals has remained an aspiration yet to be achieved. So the second pillar of the military as being an accentuating factor or a consolidatory factor to the presence of Mr. Museveni still reigns high. And then, of course, the third one is what for me I call the liberation war psychosis in this country. A state of fear and a state of entitlement. By liberation war psychosis, I mean that I take you back to the war that brought this current government to power between 1981 and 1986. That war was run on the narrative that you can't sleep as Ugandans. There's brutality in the current regime at the time of Obote and the other leaders. And so the people were tired of this war. In Uganda, they used to call it duka duka, run and run off. I mean, there was that cycle of you running from this presidency to the next, you're running a cyclic lifestyle of people running during civil war. So there is a team or a generation that saw that and it got tired. And then here come the messiahs in the name of Museveni to stop that. Now, the consolidation of power by the current presidency has been so much about remember what we did for you. Remember what we brought. For me, what I Christianize a liberation war psychosis, where you keep people in a state of remembrance and of the evil they faced, and then you're using that as a trump card to explain your relevancy, to explain the fact that they should be they should be very, very, they should support you, because after all, without you, they're nothing. You create a mysticism, an aura of infallibility and an aura of the fact that if we go, what we fought will come back. And that has been a very strong pillar in consolidating power in this country, especially for us as a country that is emerging from conflict, the ruled by liberation movements. Similar examples in Mozambique, in elsewhere, where there's been liberation movements. So indeed, I answer your question in affirmative, albeit with the emphasis on those three pillars.
Thank you, Nkubi. Right, let me also rope in Professor Jill Cottrell-Guy on this, maybe on a wider policy and a wider perspective, looking at the continent and also what has been happening entirely in the world. But we can never gaze in Africa, because out of about 48 new constitutions in Africa enacted in the 1990s, 33 of them provided for term limits for the office of the president. Now, amazingly, nearly 30 countries have contemplated the removal of term limits since 1998. What do you think is occasioning this particular development, Professor?
Thank you very much. I'd like to say that it's by no means unique to Africa. I'm looking at other studies of this issue, and somebody has said that a recent study said that about 1/3 of presidents have sought to change, and this is worldwide, right? Not just about same proportion, perhaps. At least 1/3 worldwide in this century have tried to change term limits. The motive? Well, I suppose very often it's a sort of conviction on the part of presidents that somehow they're indispensable. This is the way I think they would rationalize it to themselves, especially if they've come into a country taking office at a difficult time, and they believe, as we were just hearing about Uganda, they have saved the country in some way from disaster. They cannot imagine perhaps the country without them. This is ignoring issues like, crude let's put it frankly, looting, which takes place all too often. But I think very often it is people who simply cannot imagine life, the country without them. And unfortunately, perhaps very often they manage to convince the population as well that the country cannot survive without them. It's interesting that perhaps it was not so surprising that after independence, when independence heroes took office, that people found it hard to believe that those people would not be allowed to continue in office, and their constitutions usually did allow them to do that. But it's a bit depressing that now that we've had 50 years or more of independence, that somehow people believe that they have some sort of monopoly over power and the ability to bring change in their country. We can see it perhaps with President Kagame in Rwanda, who I think does suffer from this sense that he's indispensable. He also, of course, has a great fear that if he's not there, somehow the top will be taken off the bottle of violence in the country, and all the gains they've achieved since then may disappear. Obviously there is an issue here, but it is also hard to believe that the whole destiny of a country can turn on only one individual.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe I should ask you then, when we look at continental bodies like the African Union, or regional bodies like the East African Community as well, we find that the AU has been millimarked on this particular issue for the longest time. Yet, we have the AU's Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which was ratified in 2012, and it rejects unconstitutional changes of government. But interestingly also, it doesn't say anything specifically about abolishing term limits. And I'm inclined to wonder, Professor, if this ambiguity in norms and policies could be the reason for the studious silence from AU. Very briefly, before we go back to Bobby.
I'm not sure I'm an expert on the psychology of the AU, but very often these organizations are essentially, the prominent members of them are people in a particular position themselves, which they may wish to retain. I think it's also right to point out this recent development with the declaration in Tunis, which is, although of course this was led to a considerable extent by NDI, but a statement of in support of the limit on terms.
Right, thank you. Bobby, over to you, and we want now to look for, cases for and against presidential term limits. Let's just begin briefly with the case against, right? And the most fundamental argument against presidential term limits is that it may controvert the will of the democratic majority. So why should we be having, a line drawn in the sand against the will of the people, Bobby?
Very true, and I think hot on what Professor Guy was saying about Africa and African institutions in trying to deal with aspects or facilities that entrench democracy in the continent. You come across and you find these dilemmas, as you've put it, because even in looking at our constitutional drafting process, which, as I was saying earlier, began way back in 1992, and you look at the drafts that came out, the Guy draft and report in 2002, the Bomas draft in 2004, the rejected referendum Wako draft in 2005, the harmonized draft constitution of Kenya that we, the committee of experts, published. You find that there was a sustenance of presidential term limits that were agreed upon way back in the early 90s. And in that regard, there wasn't so much debate around the term limits. In fact, for us, as a committee of experts, you find that we, in what we propose in terms of the system of governance, the hybrid system with the duality of power in a presidency, what you call a state president, and a prime minister, we actually went further to, in a very maybe sounding absurd way, put term limits for the prime minister who would serve within a Westminster way of governance. This was very unique, but it was because we were living to what Kenyans were saying and stating in terms of entrenching term limits. And so sometimes I ask myself, and when I have discussions with people around this, I ask myself, so why didn't we, if term limits are the panacea to holding and wielding of uncontrolled power, then why don't we go ahead and, or why didn't we go ahead and even prohibit and say that the two-term limits, this is final, this Article 142 of the Constitution shall never be abrogated. Why didn't we go to that extent? And it's because I think of the dilemma that the expanse of power and politics, and especially democratic politics espoused through political power parties. The fact that the theater of operation of politics is the attainment of power, and to that extent supremely. And that is why political parties always venture to get majorities, and those that manage to do, we've seen, in countries like India and many others, where many of these facilities that are put in place to consolidate democracy, but also to emasculate power, being chopped away. And so I think that is also one of the aspects that we need to discuss clearly, because this debate, and especially here in Kenya now, has gone public and is going to go even deeper. And we need to find arguments that explain this contradiction between the aspiration to attain power, and maximally so, and the facilities that are available to limit this. I think that is a very important issue, and I think we need to consolidate these arguments. We need to tell wananchi that the purposes, and again, this came from wananchi, especially in Kenya. When you look at the Guy report, the final report of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission that was published in 2005, you see incessantly the Kenyan public talking about control of or limitation of executive power, limitation of power. And it's because of the evils that visit with them when power is not controlled. We have to remember, Steve Biko did remind us that once you test power, once a group of people get together and they do get to enjoy privilege, what we call the trappings of power, then they begin to believe that they're the only people who should do so unfettered. And so I think this is very important going forward. Let's disabuse our minds that it's a moral argument that is accepted to people. As you clearly said, there are arguments for it, and these are being used, including the example been given in Uganda, and professors talked about it, where incumbents create narratives that enable them to hold on to power and to convince people that they are gods to be forever.
Right, it's important that, yeah, we're talking of narrative. Maybe I will cross over also to Dr. Maria in Uganda. You know, also presidents have argued that, you know, the term limits undermine policy continuity and therefore development. I don't know what is your experience in Uganda, and you can see, and we've mentioned before the Messiah syndrome, that I'm the one who is a stabilizing figure in this country. If I go, especially if there's ethnic fragmentation, then of course the country will bottom out. Your thoughts?
For me, I think I want to say really, as a person who fully participated in this whole wide, extensive constitutional making process in Uganda that took us 5.5 years, 4 years of educating the people and gathering information, and 1.5 years of constituting a CA. The people of Uganda were tired, sick and tired of violence, and they took the power in their hands to give their views. They are the ones who brought the whole issue of term limit. It didn't come from the commission. They are the people who brought the issue of CA, Constituent Assembly, because they said, now that we know what a constitution is, now that we have put in our views, we don't need the current parliament to discuss. We want to elect new people who will go with that perception and our views. And the whole exercise was really done, and the president was with it, seemingly with it, and because he really wanted this constitution, and we brought it to CA, and CA did not even stop on term limit. They also put in age limit. We did all we could to ensure that actually people will prevail. And of course, one thing we didn't do was to entrench this provision. That's the challenge they were putting forward for us. And we did that because of the trust, the innocent, genuine trust with which, you know, we saw our president. I tell you, when he came, he was like our savior, picking us from a deep, deep ditch. And now we have started building the country, getting it from the dogs on the road. And all of us were excited. We trusted one another. We didn't see the evil mind in the leadership of this president. And of course, when he came down now to say, remove the term limit, it was terrible. I personally cried, I'm telling you. I had, you know, I don't know how to explain this, but let me tell you. The African people, I think, until they stop seeing power as the source of wealth accumulation, until they stop tribalism and ethnicity, this narrow mind, this inward looking, this hopeless, foolish, I don't know what to call it, slave mentality, I don't know where they got it from, until they see power as a way of serving their people, until they realize that we must change. In other words, until we get a mind shift, this constitution, writing them and whatever will not help us. You can't believe that President Museveni, as soon as the constitution started to be implemented and he realized what the constitution means, separation of power, even presidents as ignorant as the population. Because this is a fellow who loved the constitution but not loving constitutionalism. When constitutionalism started to work, he said, excuse me, you're taking my power. And for the first time I heard him say, but what is a constitution? A constitution is just a piece of paper, like Obote said. So whichever president we get in Africa here, because they love us so much, they don't look at it as service. You have our president saying that for me, if you think you elected me to serve you, you are wasting your time. I went in for my ideals. Of course, they reach there, they impoverish our people to make them beggars, to worship them. They make sure our people are completely ignorant. And once they are poor, once they are ignorant, they manipulate them. They harass them with militarism and that kind of thing, send them fear, and then they take over power, they grab the whole authority, and they use it for themselves, including the leaders whom we choose. I want to tell you that we are very strong on checking the powers of the president. We said we didn't want to be like in the Obote time, so we made sure that the president in the constitution can never take action alone. That's why we said in whatever she does, the parliament must approve. We were thinking that the parliament being elected by the people will behave, but these thugs also, they are just interested in money, in accumulating wealth. It is just a transactional parliament. It is a transactional government. Had forgotten the people long ago, and we are going back where we came from. You Kenyans, you better take care. I'm telling you, when the term limit was removed, that's why I went to court. I cried in the house, we cried, and you can see the impact of removing the term limit. We are going back. Eventually, the age limit was also removed. It is so painful. It is so painful.
Indeed, it is painful. And maybe also to share your thoughts, Mr. Nkubi, I will remind you what also President Yoweri Museveni said during his inaugural speech in 1986, January 29th. He said, and I quote, "Ours is not a mere change of guards, but a fundamental change. The problem of Africa in general and Uganda in particular is not people, but leaders who want to overstay in power, which breeds impunity, corruption, and promotes patronage. For us in NRM, we shall be here for only 4 years, after which we shall hand over power to a free and fairly elected civilian government." This is what he's saying. Do you think we should be taking also this sort of pronouncements that are rolling off their tongues seriously? Because this is a leader that we take has an ability of character, and whatever he says, he will stand by it. But we've heard also from Maria that he says also constitution is just a piece of paper. Mr. Nkubi?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the statement, the president, of course, I should remind you that he has since amended it.
Yes.
He said those who overstay in power without the mandate of the people. That's what he meant. He claims that that's what he meant. Of course, it's a cynic amendment, which is very interesting. And I'm sure Dr. Miria will tell us where it came from, but he amended that. But you see, again, it goes back to the fundamental mistake that the liberated Ugandans made then, and I should make that in quote. What happened in 1986 and the 4 or 5 years therefrom was that the NRM undertook a very strategic, deliberate program of demobilization. In essence, if you know that the people have contributed to you going to office, you know their capability even in removing you. So what you do, you make sure that once you are high up there, you demobilize them, such that you don't leave them in those groupings of power that could potentially be a spark to your removal. And this is a very, very deliberate plan for every liberation movement in Africa, apart from probably ANC in South Africa, that the moment they come to power, rising on the mantra of the people, the moment they reach, they embark on a program of demobilizing those people. Actually, they demobilize and philosophize politics. It is made philosophical, sophisticated, and then they tell you, people, we have come. You can sleep now. You have ushered us in, and let us now be. For me, I contend that the fundamental mistake was done by the generation that supported him, and that generation did not follow up its win, its victory. It removed its hands, its feet from the pedal, overtrusted these leaders, and they withdrew their scrutiny, their oversight. And if you're very clear and you follow intently, you'll discover that liberation movements in other parts of Africa, like Uganda, are very different in terms of accountability than when
Yes.
you go, for example, to South Africa, where the people remained mobilized. Here in Uganda, what we did was to disband cooperative movements because, you know, they were bringing people together. He came in and disbanded all political parties, arguing that they were sectarian. The issue was not actually that they were sectarian per se. The issue was that you cannot leave a group together united because you know the importance and the power of union. It has taken you to the throne. It can remove you. So for me, it's not a question of whether we needed to trust these people or whether they had done these wonders. The question at the time was just the benefit of doubt, that just like the others, we can't trust these ones. Rather, this time around, let's have these robust, people-led, not formal, people-led, grassroots oversight, social mobilized organizations to keep them under check. But of course, we opted for formal organizations, which later were infiltrated by the same people, the judiciary, the legislature, and so forth. And you cannot, and I have argued, you cannot rely only on these power, on the presidential term limits and the formal institutions without oversight of mobilized, politically awakened people. And to do that, of course, you should not close the power of association. And these people have known, and they know that as long as you keep people not united, you can rely on the constitution, you can manipulate it because you've demobilized people. So for me, the process of demobilization and depoliticization is responsible for where we are now, and not when we didn't complement the term limits with building the conscientization of the people.
Right. Thank you, Nkubi. Prof. Guy, maybe just to also bring your thoughts on this particular question I'm about to ask. In regard to the age of the incumbent president, we can see more youthful presidents who will otherwise face greater career uncertainty in the event that they leave office will have a stronger urge than older rulers to hang on to power. And of course, case in point is what is the current state of play in the country as well. We've had pundits saying, oh, President Uhuru Kenyatta should actually retire and go where? He's still a youthful president. He's got a lot of years ahead of him, and he can be instrumental in leadership still, even after the term limits. So this notion about the age of incumbent president being used, what are your thoughts about it? And as far as the Constitution is concerned, it seems like an entitlement. I'm young,
yes.
so I should hang on to powers,
Absolutely,
even if it's hanging on by the fingernails.
Yes, no, it does. I just wanted to add one small thing about the arguments against having term limits. And as people are probably aware, the United States Constitution didn't have term limits initially. And apart from the arguments that have been raised by yourself and other contributors, Alexander Hamilton said, well, if you don't give people a long term in office, then they won't be committed to the job. I think that was written by somebody who, of course, didn't know what would be happening in the future with the rise of career politicians and so on. He probably had the image of people coming, for a short while to serve their nation, and being people who had a substantial background with land and property and farms probably, and they wouldn't bother to leave that background unless they were going to have a substantial period to make an impact on the country. But now, of course, we have career politicians, and let's admit that sometimes many of them have not necessarily had a great career otherwise. They come into politics, they make their politics their life, and they cannot imagine a life after politics. This seems particularly unfortunate. And surely somebody who's had experience of running a government ought to be able to find something worthwhile to do for the rest of their life, instead of feeling somehow that once you're a president, almost anything else is beneath you until you are too old to do anything except go and cultivate your farm. So I really is not a convincing argument, I'm afraid.
Maybe I should come back to Bobby and ask you one simple question before we go to the safeguards that are put in place against the presidential term limits. There is Boniface Madalisto Dulani in his seminal dissertation, Personal Rule and Presidential Term Limits in Africa. Therein, he says that he states presidents who have military backgrounds will not only be more predisposed to seek the removal of term limits, but they are also most likely to draw upon the military networks to exert pressure that undermines opponents, thus increasing the chances of the removal of term limits. And if you can see a case in point is what is happening in Rwanda. They push the boundaries. Now we know that President Kagame can rule up to 2034 if God really blesses him with your longer life. And we can see also what is happening in Uganda, pushing the age limit as well. Yoweri Museveni is from a military background, and so is Rwanda's President Kagame as well. Do you think there's a penchant, especially for these particular leaders who have a background of the military, to push the boundaries, push the envelope, try and change the constitution so that they may be in power longer? Bobby?
Well, I think at times we have to personalize, in terms of looking at the personal attributes of individuals, their disposition, their viewpoints around some of these issues. Professor Jill Guy talked about the United States of America and Alexander Hamilton and his views. But we also know that, as she mentioned, term limits in the US of A, which until recently, I would say, was celebrated as a strong, exemplary democratic republic. Things are changing now with what we are seeing. But we know that term limits there were actually, in a way, entrenched through convention, through the personal views, decisions, and actions of the first president, George Washington, who also had a military background. In as much as, yes, the military, perhaps with its command structure, perhaps with the power, the militarized power function that it has. Here in Kenya, we use the terminology of, lazima utii amri, you must respect orders. So with that command behavior being ingrained in some of these individuals, Mr. Nkubi talked about, militaries in Africa that were liberation movements, that were guerrilla armies,
yes.
that literally were not really founded within the professional ambits of what you can call professional military organization. And so these individuals will perhaps use their backgrounds in the military. And we know while serving there, they also do form very powerful networks to come and eventually consolidate power and stay on. We saw this also in Zimbabwe with the late Robert Mugabe. But my take on this would be that so that we truly know, and I wouldn't say it's one bullet, fits the target. But I think we also need to personalize. We need to see the role that individuals, regardless of their backgrounds, can play in normalizing and conventionalizing some of these practices. I'll give you a quick example again here in Kenya. When we were finalizing the constitutional writing process as a committee of experts, as I mentioned earlier, the issue of presidential term limits was not all that contested. And it's because we felt as a country that we were already normalizing this. And this came from the debated discourse around Moi agreeing to leave office after expiry of his terms in 2002. So when it was the time of Kibaki, we know what happened in 2007. But by 2010, and at the time of writing the Constitution, I think it was very difficult for anyone, and especially after seeing the trend. And as I mentioned, that when you look at all the draft documents that we had, the issue of term limits was very well entrenched. But I think it is because, as can be argued, the trend was set in 2002, that the presidential term limits that were introduced in '92, and then when Moi, whom many were still not very sure whether he was going to leave office peacefully, whether he was going to breach what the Constitution put as term limits. When he did leave office, it almost now became tacit that persons who serve as presidents must leave at the end or the expiry of their term limits. So yes, military backgrounds can bear on the social intuitions of certain personalities, but go deeper and personalize so that we can be able to attribute personal responsibility in the actions of men and women who breach constitutional power control limits and want to stay in office once the period is over.
Right, thank you, Bobby. Well, just a tender reminder to our participants, of course, in a moment we shall be taking your questions. So kindly put your ducks in a row so that we can have them handy as soon as we have that particular opportunity. We're just about to wind up on this particular session. Then we go back to the questions where you can get an opportunity to fire away your questions. So, you know, you can just let us have them on our charts. There's a Q&A also section there, and then we'll pick them and we shall read them out and throw them to our panelists in a moment. I want just to rope you in, Dr. Maria, and I was just looking at an excerpt of your book, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy Betrayed, Memoirs of Maria Matembe as an Insider in Museveni's Government. And therein, there is a very interesting conversation that you had with the president over the phone. And he was saying this, quote unquote, "You see, Matembe, I also know this constitution, and after all, I'm the one who appointed you to the Constitutional Commission. Therefore, I am also aware that there is a constitution and I have no intention of violating it." It was quite a heated debate. I think you're privy to this. But in writing this particular book, The Struggles for Freedom and Democracy Betrayed, what was really your motivation? And you can also let us in on this particular conversation that you had with the president and him being cognizant of the constitution and not intending to violate it. But now what we see, or what is happening in Uganda, is diametrically different from what he's saying here.
Of course, first of all, you can say the title of the book, The Struggle for Democracy and Freedom Betrayed. I'm writing this, I wrote this book, motivation of writing this book was to tell Ugandans and the whole world about what happens when Ugandans, all this period they've gone through, you get a leader who says, now I have come to redeem you, and you embrace them, and you think they are with you, and in the process, they abandon you. This is the first time I went into politics, first in 1986, with the coming of President Museveni. I had never been there, and the reason I went there, because we were told that, you know, politics is a dirty game, and the politics is by those people in the north who were not good, who were not educated, who were like animals. And then I saw these people from the West who were educated, who were good, not animals. And they came here telling us, you know what? Politics is the science of managing society. Because I was so tired of suffering in the previous time. Knowing I'm a lawyer who knows my rights, being treated as shit, I embraced this thing with all my mind, with a 10-point program, which everybody loved so much. So we went there and we started working. And of course, as an insider, I was made a minister. And this, if you read my book well, I was like, I'm so trusted by both the man and the first lady. So we used to have extensive discussions. And so he put me on this constitution. He makes me the minister. I know what went on in this constitution. And in 2000, that was actually before 2003, when he brought this proposal to amend the constitution. And he had told me no, but he was so clever, saying, I have no intention of, you know, of not following the constitution. They would ask him, are you going to stand again? And he would say, I will follow the constitution, knowing deep in himself that will certainly bring it forward for changing. And of course, when he brought this proposal to change the constitution in 2003, I stood up and told him in his face, I opposed it. And I said, this is corruption, this is unethical, this is wrong. And of course, you know the result. After that, he threw me out, reshuffled his cabinet, and all of us who were against it were thrown out. And if you throw out Matembe from cabinet, you know you are internal friend, and throw out Kategaya, you are original like a brother. If you throw out those, then the others feared and they could not talk because they wanted to cling on to power. And when it came to parliament, corruption, he bought them. Imagine 5 million shillings and everybody went to them, because at the beginning, the whole public, we all rose up, said, no way. But when he learned it was the parliament to change it, he said corruption, he paid them, and they all kept quiet, and he changed it. President Museveni, the one I met in 86, is total opposite of the one that we have. He's a total liar. He lies every day, and it is so sad. It is extremely sad. So this book was tell Ugandans all that goes in behind the scenes, and to expose him, whether they love him or not. That is the kind of a man we have. So most of the African leaders come in, they deceive their people, but deep down in their hearts, they are driven by their personal ambition rather than a national vision for our countries.
Kubi, if you're still online, as an ancillary issue that I was talking about, the existential debate on term limits, there is a question of ideal number of presidential terms. And from the beginning, maybe we did not define term limits and the term of office, which sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they're diametrically different. Maybe you want to comment on this very briefly before we go to the safeguards, because also we're pinched for time. Very briefly, sir.
Well, I mean, regardless of what phraseology we give them, really, I find term of office more civilized, rather more a political manipulation. Anyway, it remains a term of office must have a limit per se, but conceptually, presidential term limits in various countries has really been taken to be periods of leadership, at a time within which someone undertakes his presence. Of course, there have been arguments that from literature around, and even practitioners around, especially in Africa, that so what if you're talking about limits? Should we even give them names? It's a question of sacrifice. So if I'm sacrificing myself for a country, why should you actually even limit me? Because I'm giving myself to you, to use me. I am putting my family aside to lead you, Ugandans or Kenyans or wherever, to the promised land. But ideally, these terms of office or presidential term limits, or even this quite dishonest narrative of sacrifice or the sacrificial character of a leader, they must all be tested. Again, it's probably, for me, what I take to be very pertinent, the historical evolution of the country and where it is visioned to be. And for me, it's a question of the Constitution being transformative. You see, even as we are having this debate of term limits and presidential, terms of office, whichever the case may be, in particular in Uganda, the Constitution was supposed to transform the raw power that had been achieved in 1986. Because every civil war brings with it the victor, raw power, power that has been won through bloodshed, through strife and struggle. That power, that transferred power, is supposed to be transformed by speaking to the aspirations of the people. And I think Uganda becomes the best example in its quest to transform this power. The question of the day is, to what extent, therefore, have the people who had the mandate to use the Constitution to transform the raw power they got in 1986, to what extent have they been aligned, or have they aligned their aspirations to this supreme law? And that's where I come from, that and probably continue to insist that power which is won through struggle is not transformed power, because it comes with tentacles of centralizing it into a particular person who has been leading the guerrilla war. It comes with connotations of you didn't take part, we took part, we versus I. It comes with a lot of selfishness, where some of you else, as we fought on this and this, and then it crowns itself with this feeling of mysticism and self-entitlement. Now, whichever the term you give it in the Constitution, if that Constitution or the people who are guarding it or the people who are bringing it into functionality are not willing to look at it as a tool of transformation, a tool of transformative power, the raw power they had, then that's where we get the problem. And that's why I argue, even in the paper commissioned by KI, that at the end of the day, we cannot be debating presidential term limits without constitutionalism, because we cannot have it if there is no culture of respect, of knowing that we are here to transform a power. One of the statements that were made by a very critical military personnel in Uganda, which I find to be very truthful and quite instructive in such discourse, is a late colonel. It was a colonel called Mayombo, initially an aide to the president. When he was asked what the NRM had brought in Uganda, he said, we didn't bring democracy in Uganda. We brought a democratization process. And what he meant, he went on to further explain that a process is not concluded by those who begin it. It recognizes that we shall live and others shall take after us and probably complete and refine this process. Now, some of his colleagues actually think they introduced democracy, and as thus, no one else should come, because after all, they have introduced the thing that all of you clamored for. But Mayombo seemed to be saying that, yes, we have brought this process and we have come with this power, we have it, but we have to continually transform it to fit within the aspirations of the people, generations to come. And as thus, we recognize it's a process that should be open and everyone should be able to participate, even when we're long gone. What we have now is a contradiction of
Thank you.
where they're coming coming from.
And I want to just get also your thoughts, Professor Guy, on this. There is a study that was done, and we realized that strong regional variations in adherence to term limits are evident, especially here in the Horn of Africa, where we have the highest concentration of countries without term limits. Maybe you can comment on that, looking at 8 out of the 10 countries where term limits have been undone. They're in Central Africa. Southern and West Africa have made the greatest strides in adhering to term limits, while clearly fragile term limits statutes are now in place for most of the countries in North Africa. Why is the Horn of Africa the highest in terms of concentration of countries without term limits?
That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure how well qualified I am to answer it. I think we also find a number of countries in the region have suffered from a good deal of turmoil. And maybe this goes along with the sense that you need a strong leader who can stay there for a long time. As I suggested earlier, that's usually something that the leader themselves believes in. So I think it's probably all to do with a question of the particular, the history, immediate history, and so on of the particular countries. Whereas you might think, though, in more mature democracies, without a perhaps recent history of turmoil, it might be easier for people to accept the idea, both the individuals in office and the community, that they have only a limited term. And if you look around the world, you'll see also, I mean, we have Russia is a notable example of a country in which the president is not accepting term limits and is in the process now of removing them. And again, it comes back perhaps to the fact that Russia, it's now 30 years since the end of communism, but that's not long ago, and it was a major change. China, Xi Jinping has managed to get himself to be potentially life president in a not very democratic system at all. And again, maybe a sense of facing the country has gone through a great deal of change and so on. I suppose there is also a tendency, isn't there, for countries to look at their neighbours and say, well, if they can do it, so can we. They work in both directions. The country may say, why if our neighbours have term limits, can we not have term limits? And presidents can say, why if my neighbours don't have term limits, should I have a term limit?
Thank you, Prof. So we want to bring it to a close briefly, and I'll be remiss if we don't really look at the safeguards against presidential term limits as well. And Bobby, briefly, as we're winding up, and then we throw it also to the participants, because I can see questions are streaming in that we need to answer them as well. Let's talk about the safeguards. From my own assessment, do you think if checks and balances and separation of powers are strong, presidents will be less likely to succeed in removing term limits? We're talking about institutions that are robust and strong, Bobby.
Well, I think that's very helpful. And I think Nkubi mentioned that earlier in terms of, at times we entrench these concepts and principles, as I said earlier, concepts that humankind has been developing over years to deal with raw power, to tame raw power. But these concepts also need social environments to breed in and to mature. And so if we do not put this in place, and as you said, at times in terms of strong institutions, strong cultures, and could be talked about constitutionalism, keep the issues burning, the citizens debating. Like I mentioned, on the issue of how do we carve out arguments that help what we call the ordinary wananchi in Kenya, ordinary citizens, be able to appreciate, unpack some of these concepts and make decisions on their own. And when you look at this, then it strikes you that you need movements. You need, to use a phraseology, the cliche, you need to be ever vigilant with some of these processes. Otherwise, as we've seen here in Kenya, and as I mentioned, we are taking it for granted that since 1992, with the making of the constitution, opinion was heavy that we should sustain term limits. But the ghost has come out of the bottle now, and we're talking about it. And again, we also need to correctly direct, some of these issues. You had the discussion about term of office and term limits, and perhaps we also need to ask ourselves: is it the administration that we need to get out of office after the prescribed term limits, or is it the political philosophy? Is it the ideology that we also need to make sure lives with a person who's living at the end of his or her term? Because here again, we have seen the creative way that might be used to ensure that certain ideologies, certain political networks, certain personalities can come back into administration, and for that matter, high-level executive administration, without tampering with term limits, but by creating other avenues.
Very fair enough, Bobby. Let me come to you, Dr. Miria. We can talk about strong political parties, opposition and inter-party democracy as well. And evidently, we see that when we have the incumbents, also they try to suppress, that particular space for multi-partyism, so that they can actually continue and extend their term limits. As a safeguard, how should political parties and inter-party democracy be entrenched to make sure that at least we have a stronger voice that can agitate, the extension of presidential term limits? Briefly, and what is happening in Uganda as far as the current state of play is concerned, where parties are being also suppressed?
You remember the first thing I told you when you asked how is Uganda? I said in confusion.
Yes.
So that's what I meant. How can you build strong political parties when the person in power wants all the power for himself and does not want political parties? In fact, for me, having experienced a government without political parties of NRM compared to where there are political parties, I tend to think that in Africa, we really need our type of nature of democracy. Because like in Uganda here, you cannot build strong political parties when the political environment is certainly not allowing them. And when it comes to militarization of the state and personalization of everything, like for instance, in our country, Museveni is equal to Uganda. He will tell you also, leave my oil alone. I can't allow my oil to go to any other person. You see, for me, in all these things, as we talk, as we debate, I think the fundamental issue goes to the African people in general. We need a mind shift. We need to refine ourselves as a people and get to know who are we, where are we going, so that even the leaders we get follow a national vision. When we are talking with other countries, they say they are protecting their national interest, their continental interest. When you ask, what is the interest of African people? even when they are meeting these donors, when they are talking all these international arrangements, what interest do African people defend? I think whether you remove the term limit, whether you keep it, whether you do what, there is a big need for the shift of mind of the African people to abandon the tribal mind, the ethnicity mind, and rediscover ourselves. I don't know how we are going to do this, but our hope cannot be in political parties, because which country now would you tell me? Maybe Ghana, perhaps, in Africa, which has strong political parties that can provide check and balance. These leaders who come talking of fundamental change, and in the end, they do worse than whom they have replaced. The whole idea is, I don't know how we can mobilize our very people, the people themselves, to be able to be the one to determine who should lead them, how they should be led. I don't think I have a solution to this thing, but as far as I know, we need a total mind shift to start afresh, to begin afresh. Maybe because we are stopped from developing ourselves to what we would have become, that's why we just became who we became. But until we are sick and tired of our situation and be able to rise up and throw away the yoke from our neck and be free to be African people, to see ourselves as real people of substance, to see our continent as a continent that is, plundered all this time. To look at this colonization, we are continuing to sell our land, sell our resources, to all because of self-centeredness. Until we look broader and abandon the issues of personal ambitions and look at national ambition and look at national visions for our nations and look inside ourselves as the African people to begin to live. I don't have other solutions on this matter. It is very painful.
I can see it. Thank you.
As an African woman, because I know what we go through in these situations.
Yeah, and we share your concern and of course your pain as well. Let me just go to the Q&A session, because also we are really pinched for time. And there is a question for Ms. Nkubi. Arthur Nsereko is asking, so James Nkubi, would remobilization and repoliticization of the masses be the cure, or having the term limits entrenched? Are the masses that conscientized? Even the amendment of the entrenchments is something a sitting government can achieve through a well-orchestrated referendum.
I mean, my answer is in the affirmative. In Africa, I mean, where we are emerging from, or actually still contending with looters in the name of leaders, or genuine people who eventually are turned around by the trappings of power. You cannot rely only on the Constitution. Rather, we need to be debating constitutionalism, but even more importantly, a key component of constitutionalism, the people. The people, to one extent, that sometimes repoliticizing them or mobilizing them is not enough. Sometimes we may have to actually radicalize them in what is owed to them. Sometimes the connotation of radicalization has been vulgarized by especially the discourse on terrorism, but there's emerging discourse that actually I could radicalize for good when I'm so obsessed with constitutionalism or oversight over power that nothing bypasses me. This what explains. Let me give you a very vivid example. In Uganda in 2018, the first 6 months of 2018, there were over 20 to 30 protests And these protests were by people, poor people, you could call them vulnerable people in rural areas. And they would, you know, they were about service delivery, they were about water, about electricity, and they were led by, you know, someone could call them common women and men of the village. They block a road and they confront an electricity distribution company here and there, and they're like, we demand this. 60, and they did this, all of them were not recorded in the newspapers. Why? Because we have taught people that the only potential protest or mobilization that is worth is that one that is led by a politician. In essence, we have created bridges where the people can only access services, not because they believe they should have them, where they can, you know, push for accountability, not because they believe they should actually do that, but because they get this trust and put it in a particular politician. My view is we should shift and transform that ideology from trust from individuals as bridges to transformation, rather to the individuals themselves, to the citizens themselves, to begin demanding this. So yes, if we politicize and mobilize more the people without individual culting, we can—
I'm sorry to butt in. Thank you. Thank you, Nkubi. Because of time, we're supposed to be winding up. I just want also to get the next question and throw it to Professor Jill. There's Alex Obutu, who is saying, or asking, how can nascent and young democracies, particularly those in Africa, navigate the emerging changes at the systemic level? On the one side, you have Western world preaching democratic crusade, and on the other hand, you have a rising China championing economic crusade. It is tempting for African leaders, at least those disinclined to embrace democratic ideals, to align with China, to leverage widespread economic disempowerment to entrench themselves by waving an entrenching economic narrative at the expense of democratic progress. Keep in mind that even within its democratic framework, China recently removed term limits and is viciously eroding democratic ideals where they can engage, e.g. Hong Kong. How do you engage citizens in such a context? And I think also you weighed in on, of course, President Xi Jinping now facing, you know, a lifetime sort of presidency because that term limit was abolished completely. I know it's a lengthy one, but at least you get the gist of the question.
Indeed, I do. It's a very, very difficult question. The temptation has always been there, I think, to align oneself with a country that doesn't seem to impose certain expectations on one if one is a government, and also the Chinese are offering a great deal. So at least that's the way it seems at the time. Although now we're beginning to get worried in Kenya about the size of the debt to China, among other debts that we have incurred. And as with so many questions, it comes, I suppose, ultimately to the strength of democracy and the people's will to resist. And it's a huge problem. I'm not sure that I have any response to it. It's all tied up with I mean, this has been a subject of discussion for many years, right? Not just in the context of what our discussions today, but generally the dependence that countries see for themselves, that is, governments see for themselves, on countries wealthier than they are and able to put economic pressure on them. So that the decisions they're making very often are to some extent not their own decisions, but a temptation also to align themselves with countries which might not offer too much of a critique of the policies they're adopting, including, of course, policies on issues like on how they're going to dispose of their mineral resources, which is a very important factor for China. But I'm not sure there's a very clear answer to the question.
Well, I think you did very well, thank you. So I want to throw this question from Super Churchill, who is asking, what do the Kenyan panelists on the program, that is Jill and Mukangi. As we've heard from Jill, we can actually give this to Mukangi. How to say about the inducements and incentives that Kenyans had to dangle to persuade President Moi to accept the introduction of term limits, including hefty retirement packages that the country can ill afford, especially with younger presidents like Uhuru Kenyatta, who, God willing, will have a longer period to draw benefits that accrue to retired president, and the unstated but seeming assurances that he will not be prosecuted for misdeeds while in office. Could lack of such incentives be the reason most presidents in Africa, including in Uganda, Rwanda, and elsewhere, are reluctant to embrace and respect term limits? Bobby, briefly on this.
Well, I think that could be an important factor, and especially now even more relevant when you look at the situation in Angola, the changes that took place between the retired President Dos Santos and the incumbent President Lorenzo, changes that were intra-party, that were meant to be, have been negotiated in order to protect the president that was leaving office. But we know what has happened there. And I think that may serve as a disincentive to presidents who are in power, who feel that there are questions that may be asked of their administration once the protection against criminal proceedings that within our many constitutions protecting presidents are exhausted with leaving office. So yes, there is that quandary of presidents who fear that once they leave office, they will lose and they may end up in the Bashir situation, and so they cling to power. Very quickly, I remember in Zimbabwe, being given an anecdote, I think around 2012, that by a Zimbabwean politician there, that at some point, and I think after the 2008 elections, Mugabe was, ready to leave office at some point, but the network around him, for fear of prosecution, the military, guys being taken to ICC, the courts there, the public there dealing with them, they actually prevailed upon him and in a way sort of forced him to remain in office. So it's not only the presidents, the incumbents, but also the networks, the cronies, the people who benefit from this personality being in office, that also seek to entrench. And I think that's why we are seeing more and more creative ways by these networks, as we call them here, power cartels, of ensuring that even if the personality leaves office, they are able to entrench themselves through quasi-political parties, as Dr. Matembe alluded to, and other networks. So the incentives may work. We've seen this in Tanzania now with the fifth president. They say Rais wa awamu ya tano, fifth president of the fifth term. And we've seen these changes, although within CCM, one political party, we know the politics that's going on there. But I think, and from what I've read and seen, the way these retired presidents, prime ministers are treated sort of is as an incentive that allows them to leave office, but also the culture of how they carry themselves, how they behave, that it's okay, it's natural to be out of office, can help in mitigating this.
Yeah, sorry, allow me to interpose a bit because of time. Also, we have Gad Athaki Salu. He's saying that his question is going to either James Nkubi or Dr. Miria. Let's pick up on Dr. Miria, who's next actually. The progress towards institutionalizing the norm of presidential term limit in Uganda has been mixed mainly because of democracy. However, despite the reactions, is there a positive correlation between presidential term limits and the quality of democracy? A case study of Uganda.
Since the removal, or should I say, when we were in a one movement system of governance, we seemed to be moving well, like we had a bit more democracy, but it was waning down because the president was now disobeying the constitution, and that's why we eventually got into this multi-party political system. But since that came into power, of course, after removing the term limit, it gave the president like a life presidency. And you can imagine when you now get a life presidency with your military, with your finances, I mean, who can touch you? So things become worse and worse and worse. And so I want to say that by the time President Museveni removed the term limit, if we had got a new other president, even if his party had remained in power, but would have got a new person heading the party, who could have now begun afresh, coming in differently, the situation would have been different. And therefore, I believe the term limits are very necessary and are important to advance democratic governance. And that's why I want to appeal to the people of Kenya, please learn the experience of Uganda. Please don't remove the term limit.
All right, fair enough. Jethro Nakala is asking, democracy, just like human rights, is not an end that is attained and forever enjoyed. It requires citizens or citizen activism to claim it and citizen vigilance to secure it. Is it right to say that the citizen, as the supreme power in a state, have failed in their responsibility to organize and actively claim for their rights and vigilantly guard it? Are they complicit? He asks. Nkubi, maybe you want to take on this?
I think it's not a question of complexity. I mean, the complacent nature of the citizens, because we have seen Africa again, the uprising in the Arab Spring has been an eye-opener to this, but it's rather the constraints that are around them. Here we are dealing with a poverty-stricken population in Africa. Many people working from hand to mouth, and when you look at you tell them to engage in some of these activities, it is so much about what will I eat tomorrow, and you know very well that authoritarianism thrives pretty well where there is poverty, because the preoccupation of the people then is not necessarily how to hold someone to account, but rather how to survive. So yes, the people can, if they are unionized, but I don't think it's a matter of saying that they're being complacent, but the restrictions are simply beyond. The militarism is simply out of this place, the kind of restrictions, surveillance, and all of that. And then when you complement that, or rather you couple that with poverty, you have a cocktail of a demobilized or a stagnant population, which goes back to a prolonged approach of mobilization.
All right, thank you. Oh, over to you, Professor Jill. Stephen Amani is asking, and I like what Dr. Miria had alluded to, that we should learn from Uganda. He's asking, we are seeing Honorable Raila Odinga and President Uhuru Kenyatta struggling to get numbers in order to control Parliament. In the event Parliament amends the Constitution and remove the presidential term limits, what strategy can the civil society organizations use to address such a stalemate?
Many people are thinking that the strategy at the moment is not so much to remove the formal term limit on the president as such, but to change the system of government to some extent to give the incumbent president possibly a life after the presidency. But if they did formally change the term of office of the president, of course, there has to be a referendum. But then we have seen what's happened in so many countries, including Uganda, when you have a change of, when you're removing the term limit of presidents, of course, so often coupled with something else, some other incentive to the population to vote in favor of this. If it should come to that, then it'll be one of the biggest challenges that Kenya has ever faced, I think, in terms of organization on the part of civil society, to mobilize people to vote against. And we will face very much the same problems as many other countries have faced. Fortunately, perhaps, with Kenyatta having been there only for actually less than 10 years, people can remember that he hasn't been there forever, as it were, and people could imagine having an alternative president, and there will clearly be parts of the country which would be very reluctant to vote in favor of that, because it means the continuation of a particular individuals from particular ethnic groups, making it more difficult to have a change of leadership as well. Going back to if I may say, the other possibility, which is the disguised removal of the presidential term limit by offering an alternative, which still is not clear what's going to happen, what the proposals are going to be, I have to say. But that's one theory, that it's being structured so that finally Raila Odinga gets to be president, and but Uhuru Kenyatta, being, as somebody said earlier, too young to leave office, gets the chance to become the Prime Minister. I think I would align myself with considerable sections of civil society and others who would say this is a disgraceful way of proceeding, to amend the Constitution with a process that has not been much of a process, with a view to benefiting a rather restricted range of people. Eyes are on senior office.
Thank you, thank you. All right, Bobby, there's a question for you there. Is there any role, and this is from Super Churchill, is there any role that the deep state, military included, plays in the trend to revert to live presidencies in Africa, considering the situation at some point in 1998 in Zimbabwe, when the late Changirai defeated President Mugabe in the first round, prompting the military to come in the open and make it known that they will never salute an individual who never fought for the country's liberation from British colonial rule, even if he won the elections in the repeat polls. Bobby, over to you.
Yes, I'd mentioned that from Tuba confirms that.
Yes.
But again, we look at the neighboring country, Malawi, and the role that the military there played in the very recent contested presidential elections. So yes, and I think when we look at the military, we must also, as Nkubi reminded us earlier, look at the antecedents around what we call a military, the origins of the so-called military. And so you find that, like the example of Zimbabwe, the former freedom fighters, the so-called veterans, who again ended up being in the military, ended up being in the power cartels, the economic cartels, wanting to protect their interests. And it's happening even now, where we find the military is pretty much entangled with the state. But as I mentioned, we have a good example, a very good example in the military of Malawi, where we can see professionalism, being alive to constitutional, democratic principles, understanding your role as an organ of security. And it will be interesting also to see how the military on a day-to-day basis in Malawi behaves, because that also gives you a take as to how it may want to behave in terms of succession politics, where you find militaries heavily entrenched in so-called liberation struggles, heavily entrenched in a day-to-day administration. And slowly in Kenya, we're beginning to see this, unfortunately, where the military or military personalities are being given civil public roles. So if there's good separation of functions, professionalism, then each organ, each institution will understand the role that it's supposed to play within the constitutional context. But if there is entanglement, then definitely what we've seen in Uganda, what we've seen in Zimbabwe, and many other African countries where the military is part and parcel of everyday civilian administration, then that may end up in a situation where term limits are only limits on paper and in words, but are not real, because the military has to sustain itself even beyond individuals.
Very unfortunate there. If it will be the state of play. Now, let's just also throw this question to James Nkubi. This is from Edrin Mwanyama, and he is asking, or he's saying, can we recall, James Nkubi, can we recall, think, dream, speak to the ultimate realization of restoring presidential term limits in Uganda? How soon will this be, if achievable?
Well, I wish I was a prophet. To prophesy. but for me, really, these are matters that we keep chipping away on.
Yes.
I think that's why I insist that we must treat this as a democratization process. I do not think, and I sympathize with people who think, sometimes, overconfidently so, that change would come in a whisker. My belief is the continued chipping away on some of these problems we're facing. For example, in Uganda, I celebrate the fact that the parliament is restoring term limits, that actually is looking at entrenching them. I'm looking at a situation where we're having a young generation coming up and it's beginning to make demands. I celebrate small protests by women in villages, unknown, in the newspaper. They can make it in the newspapers. I celebrate those small victories of people who are seemingly common palace people coming up and claiming what rightfully belongs to them. So for me, a conglomerate of all of those give us hope to actually know that at one time or another, if we continue to fuel them legally, they could be some bright day at the top. So for me, it's us taking this as a process and never putting a timeline and celebrating the small victories that keep coming our way as we push them through.
Right, it's a good question there. I mean, it's a good answer that you've given. We're actually coming to a conclusion, and I just wanted also to just hop in, Dr. Maria, and ask you a very simple question from your statement that you had earlier made about the third termism in Uganda. You once warned women that should the constitution be amended to allow President Museveni to serve a third elected term, it will turn out to be a sad term. Sad term. So that is just a play on words that you had there, sad term. What were you actually envisioning with a sad term?
Yes, of course, I told you I had lived in Uganda and seen all these other violent governments, the way they came, the way they went. And President Museveni came in promising a fundamental change with 10-point program, wonderful program. And we rose up and embraced that program. And we put the term limit. And we knew that he was truthful because he had talked about the problem of Africa being those leaders who don't want to quit. And we trusted him. And now a situation came, he started behaving like those other people. By the time he removed the term limit, he was already going bad, the way down, and we could see. And so it was very clear that if we allowed him to remove the term limit, he would certainly go down that drain. And so they were calling it third term. And I interpreted it to mean third term because the population was saying he has had 2 terms, we can give him a 3rd term. Actually, the population, some people are saying 3rd term, meaning the 3rd one. And me, I said, no, this will turn into a 3rd term. And in fact, it has turned into an extremely 3rd term.
I like the coinage.
3rd terms. I don't know how Uganda will be redeemed from this. And I am sure all those people who did that, they will live to regret. You remember the Prime Minister when he was being chased away and all his wife and all his relatives, they regretted why they did that. But unfortunately, that even the last safety net of age limit we had put, you saw how this time he fought militarily. The first removal of term limit, he did it by corruption and money. The removal of the age limit was real shameless, militarily injuring the members of parliament and that kind of thing. So you can see.
Indeed, you're on fire and we're watching you burn. Dr. Maria, you're on fire.
Please, Kenyans, don't mess.
Don't miss. Good message for Kenya. Thank you. Thank you. Lastly, let me just close up this Q&A session with Professor Jill. Looking at the organs, we discussed African Union and how also it has been milling-mouthed regarding the presidential term limit. We have the East African community as well. And we know within the 5 states in the East African community, 3 of them have breached this presidential term. So how do we have the moral voice, the moral imperative to actually speak on presidential term limits as an organ, as a East African community? Briefly.
I'm not sure whether I can add much to your actual question. Yes, it's a very good question. I was saying earlier that there is a tendency to look at one's neighbors and say, well, if they do it, why can't I? Or more nationally, if they can do it, why can't we? And it's unfortunate that the countries are not setting good examples to each other, but are rather setting retrograde examples to each other. And it is a huge pity because I think in many ways, organs of like the East African community of greater cooperation between African countries could offer, some ways the African Union, as again you pointed out, on this particular issue, they have not done so well, but on other issues, they have been trying to lay down standards. It is a disappointment. Much as I'm an enthusiast for the East African community, on this particular issue, they haven't been doing us a great deal of assistance. It really, at the moment, our last speaker pleaded with Kenyans not to take that step backwards, and ultimately I feel it's got to be the issue of the decision of Kenyans.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a very cogent, insightful discussion. And it does not stop here. The series continues. And I want to thank you for your invaluable insight that we've had today. I'll just give each of you, beginning with Bobby, just 30 seconds to give your closing remarks. Then we shall move on to close the program briefly. Bobby, your closing remarks.
Maybe I'll close with, again, a bit of a wordplay, following on the footsteps of Dr. Matembe, about the 3rd term. And this comes from where I come from in Kenya, Swahili speaking, vowels are the right sounding word. So where you talk about term limits, somebody would say tamu limits. Tamu in Swahili means sweet. And so when we talk about limiting sweets, and when we think about us as human beings, that, and I go back to what Stephen Biko reminded us, that when you give power to people and they start enjoying it, they begin believing that that privilege belongs to them and them only. And so we must be very vigilant, remain vigilant, remain organized, continue talking about this issue, understanding the fact that term limits are a construction around ensuring that democracy enables us to deal with this ogre called power. And I think it is very important that we as Kenyans, East Africans, and Africans, and the global community at large continue engaging, building concepts, good anecdotes that will help us ensure that democracy is entrenched.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's cross over to Dr. Maria, your closing remarks briefly.
I want to thank you for having invited me to participate in this debate. At least I'm happy. I'm sharing with people of the same view, and talking will help us one day to achieve what we want to achieve. I want to say that at least in Africa, it has been proved that term limit is maybe the best way of preventing these greedy leaders who never want to leave power. It has been proved. It has worked in West Africa. It has worked in down south. It has been working here in East Africa. And so my appeal, it may not be the only way of building democracy, but at least it's a step forward. It can help. It can help us to now find ways of bettering our situations in Africa. And against this background, I want to appeal to President Kenyatta of Kenya. I have been hearing his videos saying that he would love to rest when he's still young and enjoy life with his grandchildren, not behaving like Museveni. Please do stick to your word. Integrity is very important. Integrity and character is the leadership, the best characteristics of a leader, and that's the best way to retire well. How can a president now become a prime minister? Please, Kenyatta, prove to African. Don't give a leeway to Museveni to even continue forever, because he will say even that one has done it. And Kenyans, please rise up and refuse. If Nigerians could refuse, if Zambians could refuse, do it also.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Maria Matembe there. Let's hear from James Nkubu. Your closing remarks, sir, very briefly.
Well, thank you. For me, I just have one word. I mean, a constitution, however progressive the provisions may be, however glorious the preamble may be, without a people oversight over it, can never take us that far. It has to be complemented by people vigilance to bring it to life. Thank you.
Professor Jill Guy, lastly, your closing remarks.
Right. Apart from thanking my colleagues on the panel for an extremely high level and fascinating conversation, I would like to leave everybody with just two things to think about in a sentence each. Number one, if Kenya had adopted a parliamentary system, as Bobby Mkangi told us, reminded us that everybody else except the last stage of the process had recommended for Kenya, would we now be facing this particular issue? And my second thought, something I was reading recently, suggested that since there's so much resistance on the part of incumbents to accepting term limits, would it be a sort of compromise? I'm not sure this is right, but it's worth thinking about. Would a compromise be to have not an absolute bar on standing again, but the sort of provision that they actually have, I think, in Russia at the moment that Putin wants to get rid of, which is that you say after 2 terms, a person may not continue immediately, although after a certain length of time, maybe 1 or 2 terms, they could stand again for office.
A good one, a good one. Thank you so very much. And I want to thank you warmly for being amazingly patient throughout and of course engaging very actively and cogently in the discussion. I think it has been a rich discussion and we've drawn lessons from Uganda and Kenya, and also your appeal to the president of Kenya and the population and the citizenry of Kenya as well to be very, very wary of what we are trying to tinker with as far as the presidential term limit is concerned. The way Prof. Jill also you're putting it, that this is under the guise of what we do have as an initiative. We all know about it. Thank you for your participation, and Bobby Mukangi, Dr. Miria Matembe, thank you so much. James Nkubi, thank you so very much. And Professor Jill Cottrell-Guy, thank you so very much. I know we have Christine Konge and Edith Kibalama still on the line as well. I just want to give them also just a brief opportunity as we're wrapping up to just say something. Let's just begin with the Executive Director of Katiba Institute, Christine Konge. You've been doggedly following the conversation. Yes, your closing remarks, Christine.
Thank you, Diba. I'll actually join. I'll echo the comments of Jill and say this has been a most informative and entertaining section that we've really delved into some of the, what I would call traps that might lay in what some of our leaders are saying. And it is good to learn from each other to see what happened in Uganda and what could happen in Kenya, because as indicated before, we don't come from such a long time ago. During Moi's time, we were facing some of these challenges. So we should really be on our toes as citizens of Kenya to be able to not put ourselves into trouble once again. So this has been a very edifying conversation, and it's something we'll be continuing for another 3 webinars. Again, I want to thank the panelists for giving their time, for the, all the research and information that they have been able to give us, and also not to forget the National Democratic Institute for being able to sponsor both us and Kituo cha Katiba to be able to do this webinar. So thank you so much, Diba.
Thank you. Yes, and we cannot forget your solitary effort also, Edith Kibalama. Without your partnership, this particular project will not have been successful. This is just the beginning. I want to give you also a handy opportunity just to give your closing remarks. Over to you, Edith.
Mine is just thank everybody for the very excellent discussions today, and to thank all the participants. I think the discussion has been quite lively and informative, and looking forward.
Right.
So much.
Thank you.
I would like to give a big thanks to the moderator. Thank you for steering the process very well. Thank you,
Edith. Thank you, Edith. Okay. All right, and we cannot forget our participants as well. You've peppered the panelists with good questions, very insightful, thought-provoking. I want to thank you for also engaging with us since the beginning. We had technical challenges that also made us a bit late in starting off, but nonetheless, you've been amazingly patient and you followed the conversation all the way. Thank you so much. I know I'm standing in between your lunch and your work as well. I don't want to continue with more, but as we're winding up, I just wanted to read a quote from Anderson Mazoka, who was a Zambian presidential candidate. And he said, quote unquote, "History has shown us that if you let a person stay for a long time, that person wields a lot of power. He holds the purse strings of the nation because government is the biggest employer. It is the paymaster, and it is difficult to say that people are free to make decisions on their own. One cannot anoint oneself in perfume, but be surrounded by garbage and expect to smell good." And I think that's a wonderful quote from Anderson Mazoka, Zambian who was a Zambian presidential candidate. Thank you so very much for engaging actively until this part. My name is Dibala Nair. I've been your facilitator. And just to remind a participant, this is just the beginning of a 4-part series. Next will be the role of civil society, media, and religious organizations in ensuring respect for presidential term limits. The case also will be in Uganda and Kenya as well, as we continue with the theme that is we are running under presidential term limits and consolidation of democracy, experiences from Kenya and Uganda. Thank you very much. And now I want to adjourn this meeting.